Welcome to Future Epoch, where we learn more about our world. Somewhere on Earth, a child walks 2 hours to collect water that is not safe to drink. Somewhere else, a government is quietly fortifying a dam that another country considers an act of war. And in boardrooms, military planning offices, and United Nations conference halls, a question is being asked with increasing urgency: what happens when the water runs out? Water is the one resource no nation can trade its way out of needing. You can import food, import oil, import technology. You cannot import a river. And in the 21st century, as populations grow, as climates shift, and as glaciers retreat, the rivers that nations have depended on for thousands of years are beginning to fail them. More than 2 billion people currently live in countries experiencing high water stress, according to UN Water. That means demand regularly meets or exceeds available supply. By 2030, global demand for fresh water is projected to exceed sustainable supply by approximately 40%. These are not estimates from fringe sources. They come from the World Bank, UNESCO, and the United Nations, organizations that rarely reach for alarming language. The problem is structural. 71% of Earth's surface is covered by water, but only about 3% of it is fresh, and most of that is locked in glaciers and ice caps. Of the water that flows through rivers, lakes, and aquifers, over 70% is consumed by agriculture, the same agriculture that feeds 8 billion people. When water becomes scarce, every system built on it, farming, cities, industry, political stability, begins to fracture. And the fractures, once they form, have a way of spreading far beyond the watersheds where they begin. Water conflict is not new. The word rival traces back to the Latin rivalis, meaning one who shares a river. Civilizations have contested water rights since the first irrigation ditches were dug in Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago. The 20th century was supposed to change this. The post-war era produced a series of international water agreements meant to govern shared rivers by treaty rather than force. The Indus Waters Treaty of 1960, brokered by the World Bank between India and Pakistan, divided the rivers of the subcontinent's northwest between two nations that had just fought a war over territory. It survived 3 more conflicts between them and remains, improbably, in force today, though it is now under serious strain as both countries face growing demand and shrinking flows. In the Middle East, competing claims over the Jordan River between Israel, Jordan, Syria, and the Palestinians shaped decades of diplomacy and violence. A failed American water-sharing plan in the 1950s set the stage for tensions that contributed to the Six-Day War in 1967. Control of water sources in the occupied territories has been a point of conflict ever since. The Aral Sea tells perhaps the starkest story of what happens when water is mismanaged on a grand scale. Once the 4th largest lake in the world, Soviet-era irrigation projects in Central Asia diverted the rivers that fed it throughout the second half of the 20th century. By the 1990s, the sea had shrunk to a fraction of its former size. Fishing communities that once operated on its shores found themselves stranded in a desert of salt and pesticide residue, miles from a waterline that had simply retreated and never returned. The fault lines of the 21st century water crisis run through 3 regions above all others: the Nile Basin, the Mekong River, and the glacially fed river systems of South Asia. In East Africa, Ethiopia began constructing the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on the Blue Nile in 2011. It is the largest hydroelectric dam on the continent, and when it reaches full capacity, it will transform Ethiopia's economy. It will also reduce the flow of water reaching Egypt and Sudan downstream. Egypt has depended on the Nile for virtually all of its fresh water for millennia. Cairo has called the dam a matter of national security. Negotiations between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan have stalled repeatedly, and as of recent years, no binding agreement on dam filling operations has been reached. All 3 governments have exchanged language that diplomats describe, with characteristic understatement, as deeply concerning. On the Mekong River in Southeast Asia, China has built a cascade of large dams on the upper reaches of the river since the 1990s. The river then flows through Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam, supporting the food supply and livelihoods of approximately 60 million people. Studies by the Mekong River Commission and independent researchers have found that the Chinese dams have significantly altered downstream water levels and sediment flows, disrupting fisheries and rice agriculture across the region. China disputes the scale of the impact. The downstream nations are in no position to compel a change of course. The power imbalance is as stark as the hydrology. In South Asia, the glaciers of the Hindu Kush and the Himalayas feed the major rivers supplying fresh water to Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, China, and Nepal, a combined population of several billion people. Climate scientists project that these glaciers will lose a significant portion of their mass this century. The rivers they feed will not simply shrink. They will first flood as meltwater surges and then, over decades, steadily contract. The Indus Waters Treaty was not written for a world in which the ice that supplies the Indus is disappearing. What does a water war actually look like? Analysts differ on whether outright interstate wars fought exclusively over water have historically occurred, though the Pacific Institute's water conflict chronology documents hundreds of incidents in which water was a trigger, a weapon, or a casualty of broader armed conflict. The more immediate danger may be subtler, states undermining each other through dam construction, contamination, diversion, or obstruction without ever formally declaring hostilities. Internal instability may prove more immediately dangerous than interstate war. In Syria, a prolonged drought between 2006 and 2010 drove hundreds of thousands of rural families into cities already strained by unemployment and political repression. Researchers who have studied that period describe water stress as a significant contributor to the social pressure that preceded the Syrian civil war. The connection between resource scarcity and internal conflict is well documented and difficult to dismiss. Globally, the World Bank estimates that water scarcity could displace over 200 million people by 2050 in the worst affected regions, including Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Central America. That displacement does not stay local. It becomes migration, and migration becomes politics in every country it touches. The window for cooperative solutions is narrowing. International water law remains fragmented and largely unenforceable. The UN Watercourses Convention, which establishes basic principles for sharing transboundary rivers equitably, was adopted in 1997 but took until 2014 to enter into force, and many of the most important river-sharing nations have still not ratified it. Water is a geopolitical force multiplier. It amplifies existing tensions, accelerates instability, and constrains the options available to governments facing scarcity. It is not the only cause of the conflicts forming around it, but it is increasingly the terrain on which those conflicts unfold. The challenge is not that humanity lacks the engineering capacity to manage water more intelligently. Desalination, drip irrigation, wastewater recycling, and demand management all exist as proven technologies. The challenge is that the nations facing the worst water stress are often the least able to afford or deploy these solutions, and the nations that sit upstream of shared rivers frequently have little legal or political incentive to cooperate with those downstream. No international institution currently holds the authority or the resources to compel the kind of agreement that the scale of this crisis may ultimately require. The historian Stephen Solomon argued that water has always been the invisible hand shaping which societies rise, which decline, and which find themselves in conflict. What has changed in the 21st century is the speed at which that hand is moving. The Nile, the Mekong, the Indus, the Jordan, the Colorado. These rivers do not respect the treaties, borders, or political calendars of the nations that depend on them. They respond to snowpack levels, rainfall averages, and atmospheric temperatures. And those temperatures are rising. The question the world has not yet answered is whether human institutions can move faster than the climate, whether the agreements, the engineering, and the political will can be assembled before the competition for water tips from tension into something far harder to reverse. History suggests we often wait until after the crisis to build the institutions that could have prevented it. The question with water is whether, this time, we can afford to. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this content and want to see more, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel.